Right now, you are surrounded by strangers. You walked past dozens of them today, maybe hundreds. Nobody counted them. Nobody watched the ridgeline while you did it. Your body did not treat a single one of those faces as information worth acting on. That is the strange part, not the strangers, you. For nearly all of human existence, the arrival of people you did not recognize was the single most important event that could happen to your group. Not the weather, not hunger, strangers. And on the shore of an old lake in northern Kenya, 27 people are lying exactly where that event found them, about 10,000 years ago, still holding the whole story in their bones. So here's the question. When did this start? Not arguing, and not two men swinging at each other, we have always had that. Organized groups walking out with a plan to end another group. Where does that begin? Is it built into us, or did we invent it somewhere along the way? Every layer of this gets stranger than the last. Let's go. Let's start with the size of a group, because every strange thing that follows sits on top of that one number. For most of the time our species has existed, you lived with somewhere between 25 and 50 people. That was the band. You knew every face in it, every voice, every walk. You knew who was reliable in a bad season and who was not. Above that sat a wider network of a few hundred people you saw a few times a year, at gatherings, at the reliable water, at seasonal camps. Anthropologists studying living forager groups keep landing on a similar ceiling for the number of relationships one human can actually track, roughly 150. Everyone outside that number was not an enemy. They were an unknown, which, in a world with no way to send a message ahead, is a much more expensive category. Think about what a stranger actually represented. A person who knows where your water is. A person whose group might be twice your size. A person who might have walked 300 kilometers because their own valley stopped producing. You cannot check any of it. You cannot look them up. You have one shot at reading a face across 40 meters of open ground, and whatever you decide in the next 10 seconds, your children live or do not live with the consequences. That is the pressure that built the thing we are talking about. Now let's go further back than any human sight, because the roots run deeper than our species. In 1974, in Gombe in Tanzania, a chimpanzee community that Jane Goodall had been observing for years split into two. The southern group moved off. For the next 4 years, the northern males walked to the border of the southern territory, in silence, in single file, and waited. When they found a lone individual from the other side, several of them acted together against one. By 1978, the entire southern community was gone, every single member. Goodall wrote later that it took her a long time to accept what she had recorded, because it did not fit anything she had believed about chimpanzees. Here is why that 4-year sequence matters so much. It was not a burst of temper. It had 3 features that no ordinary animal aggression has. It was planned. The patrols left with intent and went to the same border. It was coalitional. Several individuals coordinated against one. And it was proactive. They went looking, at a moment of their own choosing, when the risk to themselves was near zero. Richard Wrangham built a name for that pattern. He calls it the imbalance of power. The rule is simple and it is cold. Act only when your side outnumbers the other side heavily enough that your own risk drops to almost nothing. Never take an even fight. Never take a fair one. That rule shows up in chimpanzees and it shows up in us, and the two lineages split roughly 7 million years ago. Wrangham's argument is that this is the older layer, the one we inherited, and that everything humans added on top is decoration. But here is what is fascinating. If the capacity is that old, the evidence should be everywhere in our own record. And for a very long time, it was not. Which brings us to the bones. The oldest site anyone points to sits at Jebel Sahaba, in what is now Sudan, on the edge of the Nile. It is a formal cemetery, more than 13,000 years old, holding around 60 people. Many of them have stone projectile points still embedded in the bone or lying inside the body cavity. For decades, this was described as a single, catastrophic episode, one group ending another in one afternoon. Then, in 2021, a team went back over every bone with modern microscopy. What they found changed the story and made it worse. The injuries were not from one event. There were healed wounds underneath unhealed ones. The same individuals had been through this before, recovered, and then gone through it again. This was not one afternoon. This was a way of life, running across years, maybe generations. Now go to the site I opened with, Nataruk, on the west side of Lake Turkana in Kenya, excavated by a team led by Marta Mirazon Lar and published in 2016. 27 individuals, about 10,000 years old, 12 skeletons complete enough to read properly. 10 of those 12 carry injuries consistent with an organized attack. Some have hands positioned as if they were bound. Others have obsidian projectile points still in them, and the obsidian is the detail that matters most, because that particular stone does not occur locally. Somebody carried those points in from somewhere else. That is the whole argument in one object. You do not carry weapons from another region into a lakeside camp by accident. The intent arrived before the people did. And Nataruk is the one everybody argues about, because these were not farmers. They had no fields to defend, no granary, no walls. They were mobile foragers on a rich lakeshore, and something still came for them. Then there is the single most examined individual in all of archaeology, and almost nobody remembers this part about him. The man who came out of the ice on the Italian and Austrian border in 1991 has been scanned, sequenced, X-rayed, and photographed more thoroughly than most living people. He is about 5,300 years old. He had a copper axe, which at that date made him a man of standing. He had eaten within the hour, and in 2001, 10 years after he was found, a radiologist spotted something everyone had missed. A flint arrowhead, lodged in his left shoulder, entering from behind and below. It had severed an artery. There is also a deep cut across his right hand, the kind you get from catching a blade, healed over by a few days, which means he had been through something else earlier that week and walked away from it. So the sequence reads like this: a confrontation he survived, several days on the move at altitude, then somebody at a distance, behind him, on a mountain pass at 3,200 meters. Nobody took the copper axe, and a copper axe in that period was worth more than everything else he was carrying combined. Whoever it was did not come for his equipment. Then the record changes shape entirely, and it happens exactly where Fry says it should. At Talheim in southern Germany, a pit holds 34 people from around 5,000 years before the Common Era. Men, women, and the young of a farming community, placed in one pit, most with injuries to the back of the skull matching the shape of the stone adzes those same farmers used to work wood. At Aspern in Austria and at Schöneck-Kilianstätten in Germany, the pattern repeats within the same culture and the same few centuries. At Kilianstätten, there is a detail that tells you what these episodes were actually for. A significant number of the shin bones were deliberately fractured. That does nothing tactically. It happens after the outcome is already decided, and it is directed at the people who were never coming back anyway. Which means it was for an audience. It was a message left for whoever found them. That is the moment the thing stops being a raid and starts being politics. Some of you are thinking, hold on, a handful of sites across 300,000 years is not a pattern, it is a rounding error. Fair question, and it is the best objection in this entire subject. The anthropologist Douglas Fry has spent a career making exactly that case, and he makes it with data rather than optimism. Go through the archaeological record of mobile foraging societies, the ones with no permanent settlements, and the overwhelming majority of sites show nothing of the kind. No fortifications, no mass graves, no weapon designed only for people. Fry's position is that organized group conflict is not ancient at all. It appears when humans stop moving, and it appears because they stop moving. And when you look at what a weapon actually is, he has a strong point. The oldest wooden spears we have, from Schöningen in Germany, are around 300,000 years old. They are magnificent, balanced, engineered objects. They were made for horses. Everything in the toolkit for hundreds of thousands of years is a hunting tool that can be turned on a person in an emergency. The mace is the moment that changes. A mace head is heavy, awkward, useless against an animal that runs, and perfect against a skull. It has no other job. And mace heads show up late, alongside the first permanent villages, not before them. So we have two answers that both look right. The capacity is 7 million years old. The habit looks about 10,000 years old. Both cannot be the whole story. Here is where the two halves meet, and it has nothing to do with aggression. You were not designed to trust a stranger. Sit with that for a second, because it runs against everything you did today. You were not built with a mechanism for evaluating an unknown human quickly and generously. You were built with the opposite, a fast, cheap, extremely confident sorting system that puts every face into one of two boxes, mine and not mine, in well under a second, using almost no information at all. And we can prove that part in a room, which is where this stops being archaeology. In 1971, the psychologist Henry Tajfel ran an experiment designed to find the minimum conditions for group loyalty. He expected to need something meaningful: shared history, competition, a real prize. So he started with the emptiest possible version, intending to add ingredients until loyalty appeared. He put strangers in a room and sorted them into two groups on a basis he made deliberately worthless. In some versions, they were told they preferred one painter over another. In others, it came down to whether they had over or underestimated the number of dots on a screen. No contact between members, no conversation, no history, no stake. Nobody even met the people they were now grouped with. Then he let them allocate small sums of money. They favored their own group immediately. Not slightly, consistently across every version he ran. And the most revealing finding was not that they gave their own side more. It was the strategy they chose. Given a choice between an option where their group gained the most in absolute terms and an option where their group gained less, but the gap over the other group was wider, a large share of people took the wider gap. They accepted less for themselves to make sure the other side got less than them. Over dots on a screen, between people who had never spoken. Tajfel had gone looking for the minimum conditions and discovered there were almost none. The machinery is running before there is anything to run on. And our ancestors did not leave that machinery to guess. They fed it deliberately, and they started very early. At Blombos Cave on the South African coast, there are pieces of ochre engraved with cross-hatched patterns, 73 to 100,000 years old. At School in Israel and Oued Jabana in Algeria, there are shell beads with holes worn through them by cord, over 100,000 years old, and the shells were carried inland from as far as 200 kilometers away. Ochre for the skin turns up in the record even earlier than that. Ask what a bead actually does. It carries no calories, it cuts nothing, it stops no rain. Its entire function is to be seen at distance and to say one thing, which is that the person wearing it belongs to a specific set of people. A pattern of beads is readable across 40 meters of open ground in poor light. It is the exact range at which the stranger problem has to be solved. So the ornament and the sorting machine are the same technology. One is the wiring, the other is the signal. We had both of them 100,000 years before we had a single wall. And there is a second thing our ancestors built with it, which almost never gets told alongside the first, because it is the reason the raid stayed rare for so long. Among Kalahari foragers, there is a documented partnership system called XRO. You give a gift, a knife, a string of beads, a straight arrow shaft, to someone in a distant band. There is no repayment date and no equivalence. The point of the object is that it opens a relationship. A single individual may hold a dozen of these partnerships, spread across hundreds of kilometers. What that network actually is drought insurance. When your water hole fails, you do not raid a neighbor. You walk to a partner and you are fed, because 2 years ago, you gave them a knife. The bead that marks you as one of us also marks you as somebody's guest 3 valleys over. That is the system our species ran on for tens of thousands of years. Not peace, a working alternative that was consistently cheaper than the alternative. So put the two halves together and you get the actual answer, which is not the one either side of the argument wants. The sorting system is ancient. The trigger is not. For 300,000 years, the machinery sat there, mostly idle, because a mobile band with no property and no fixed address has very little to fight over and every reason to move instead. Walking away is cheap, fighting is expensive. When a group can pick up everything it owns in an afternoon, the imbalance of power rule almost never comes out in favor of the raid. Then we stopped walking away. So what ended it? What ended 300,000 years of the cheapest solution being to leave? The answer is unglamorous, and it is a grain. Around 12,000 years ago in the Levant, groups began staying in one place through the whole year. At first because the wild stands of cereals and nuts were rich enough to make it worth it. The Natufians built stone houses before anybody farmed anything, and the moment you have a stone house, you have something new in human experience. A thing that cannot be carried and cannot be replaced by walking somewhere else. Then storage. A pit of grain is a year of your life sitting in the ground, and unlike a hunt, it does not need to be repeated daily. It just needs to be held. Then the walls. Jericho has a stone wall and a tower from around 8,000 years before the Common Era, and archaeologists still argue about whether they were built against water or against people. That argument itself is the point. By that period, a settlement was worth the effort of a wall either way. And then the arithmetic flips. Now the group that arrives at your camp is not looking for a place to stand. It is looking at a year of stored food that somebody else already harvested, sitting in a fixed location that cannot run. Watch how fast the rest of it arrives once that flip happens. Around 3,100 years before the Common Era, Uruk in southern Mesopotamia covers roughly 250 hectares, and holds somewhere between 40 and 80,000 people behind a wall about 9 kilometers long. That is more humans inside one boundary than most of our ancestors met in 100 lifetimes. The counting system that becomes the first writing on Earth shows up in the same city, and its earliest surviving use is not poetry. It is inventory. Grain, animals, and people, tracked as quantities. 600 years later, in the same region, somebody carves a limestone monument for the ruler of Lagash to mark a boundary dispute with the neighboring city of Umma. On it, the ruler's men are shown in a block, shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping into a single continuous wall, spears out at one angle, feet in step. Look at what that image actually records. Not brave individuals, not champions. A rectangle of interchangeable men moving as one object. Somebody had to train that, feed that, and organize it, which means somebody had a surplus to pay for it and a reason to keep it standing when nothing was happening. From the first stone house to a professional formation carved in stone as an achievement, the whole distance is under 7,000 years. Our species had been around for roughly 300,000. Here is the cost of that, in numbers. In mobile forager societies documented in the historical record, the share of adults lost to conflict between groups varies enormously, from close to nothing in some populations to as high as 15% in others. In settled societies, the numbers stop varying. They rise, they stay risen, and then they organize. The first standing armies appear within a few thousand years of the first granaries. Not the first cities, the first granaries. And the thing we actually lost is easy to miss, because it does not look like a loss at all. You lost the option of leaving. Every one of your ancestors for 300,000 years held one card that you do not hold. If the neighbors became a problem, if the valley stopped producing, if the situation curdled, you could pick up 40 kilos of everything you owned and be 80 kilometers away in 4 days, and the problem was simply over. Not solved, over. That was the primary human conflict resolution strategy, and it worked for longer than anything we have invented since. What if the violence was never the innovation? What if the innovation was the wall and everything that had to happen once we could no longer walk away from each other? What if a stranger stopped being an event for a reason that has nothing to do with trust, and everything to do with the fact that we built a world so full of strangers that the old alarm simply gave up and stopped firing? Because it did stop firing. That is the part worth sitting with. You passed hundreds of unknown humans today, and your body logged none of them. That is not because the sorting machine was removed. Tajfel showed it takes a screen full of dots to switch it back on. It is because the machine has been so completely overwhelmed by volume that it has stopped treating any individual face as data. The alarm did not get fixed, it got flooded. And that is why the same machinery, given a flag, a color, a team, or an accent, still comes back online instantly in people who would never in their lives raise a hand to anybody. It was never about aggression. It was always about sorting. So the honest answer to when we started going to war is this. The capacity arrived with our lineage, 7 million years back, shared with a species that still runs border patrols in Tanzania today. The habit arrived with the granary, 10,000 years back. And the thing that stood between those two, for almost all of human history, was not that our ancestors were peaceful. It was that they could leave. We traded the ability to simply walk away from each other for a roof and a full pit of grain, and most of us never even knew it was gone. So tell me in the comments, when was the last time you solved something by leaving instead of winning? And did it feel like giving up, or did it feel like relief? Because for 300,000 years, that was not weakness. That was the strategy. That was the strategy. That was the strategy.